He was the second Whig elected to the presidency, and he was the second Whig to die early in his first term, leaving virtually no impact on American politics.
Long after President Zachary Taylor was buried beneath the blazing Kentucky sun, whispers surrounding his sudden death refused to fade, drifting through generations like an unresolved echo. When scientists finally opened his long-lost coffin, nearly 140 years later, they expected clarity. Instead, they uncovered traces of a forgotten medical world whose treatments could mimic deliberate poisoning with unsettling precision. The vanishing president. When Zachary Taylor collapsed in the summer of 1850, the nation reacted with a mixture of disbelief and unease, since the 12th president had carried himself with the rugged confidence of a career soldier who seemed nearly indestructible. His abrupt decline created a vacuum of understanding that only deepened as doctors struggled to explain how a man who had survived battlefields, tropical campaigns, and frontier expeditions could succumb so quickly under comparatively ordinary circumstances. The medical reports of the era described gastrointestinal distress, fever, and dehydration. Yet their language left enough ambiguity for early observers to disagree on the precise cause, which allowed rumors to travel freely across a politically fractured country. As the days passed, newspaper columns blended sympathy with speculation, and conversations in taverns and parlors drifted toward theories that ranged from contaminated food to sinister political retaliation, which felt plausible to citizens already suspicious of Washington's fragile alliances. When Taylor was buried, the nation mourned, although many continued to question whether the official explanation captured the full truth. His coffin, eventually misplaced through decades of relocation and construction, became a symbol of a mystery that refused to settle, and its absence ensured that debate survived long after eyewitnesses were gone. America's first great conspiracy autopsy. In the turbulent political climate of 1850, every decision carried consequences that stretched far beyond the walls of the White House, which made President Taylor's death feel less like an isolated medical event and more like an eruption at the center of a nation already struggling with sectional distrust. Taylor had opposed the expansion of slavery into newly acquired Western territories, a stance that placed him in direct conflict with influential lawmakers who viewed compromise as the only path to keeping the Union intact. His resistance to the proposals that would later become the Compromise of 1850 stirred resentment among those who feared that his inflexibility might ignite a national fracture, and this tension created fertile ground for suspicions when he fell ill. Almost immediately, some Americans claimed that Taylor had been deliberately poisoned to silence his opposition, pointing to the speed of his decline and the contentious timing of his illness. Although the medical community insisted that cholera morbus, a severe gastrointestinal condition commonly triggered by contaminated food or water, offered a sufficient explanation, the public remained divided. For many, the absence of definitive forensic evidence made the official conclusion feel incomplete, especially in an era where science lacked the precision required to distinguish ordinary toxins from intentional harm. The rumors gained strength over time, propelled by memoirs, political pamphlets, and regional folklore, until they formed a parallel narrative that competed with documented history. By the late 20th century, the conspiracy had become persistent enough that historians, journalists, and even descendants began urging a modern investigation. Their calls reflected a belief that only scientific analysis, unavailable in Taylor's lifetime, could determine whether his death had been an unfortunate medical tragedy or a covert political intervention, which set the stage for a dramatic re-examination of his final days. Exhumation. After 140 years. By the late 20th century, the growing chorus of speculation convinced officials that the only way to resolve the question surrounding Taylor's death was to return to the source itself, a decision that required navigating a maze of legal, ethical, and logistical challenges. Family members, historians, and state authorities debated whether disturbing a former president's remains was an act of necessary clarification or a violation of historical sanctity. Yet, the persistent public fascination eventually tipped the scales toward action. Once approval was granted, forensic specialists prepared for an exhumation unlike any previously attempted in American presidential history, knowing that the condition of the coffin would determine how much truth could still be recovered after nearly 140 years underground. When the burial site was carefully opened in 1991, the team confronted both deterioration and preservation in unexpected proportions, as heat, moisture, and time had damaged some materials while leaving others remarkably intact. The coffin, though weathered, still held elements that offered potential windows into Taylor's final hours, and every movement by the investigators was deliberate, since untrained handling could easily compromise fragile evidence. Forensic anthropologists, pathologists, and technicians collaborated to maintain a controlled environment, documenting each stage with precision to ensure that no interpretive gaps were introduced into a case already burdened by historical ambiguity. The most delicate moment arrived when the remains were transferred for laboratory analysis, an action carried out with a level of respect consistent with both the subject's status and the seriousness of the investigation. The team understood that Taylor's body represented not only a historical figure, but also a repository of data that could finally illuminate whether his death aligned with natural disease or concealed intent. With samples secured and protocols completed, the scientific phase began, carrying the narrative from speculation into verifiable inquiry. The scientific shock. Laboratory analysis began with the expectation that modern toxicology would finally deliver a decisive answer. Yet, the results unfolded with a complexity that surprised even the scientists leading the investigation. Using neutron activation analysis, a technique capable of detecting trace elements at extraordinarily low concentrations, researchers examined Taylor's hair, nails, and bone fragments for the presence of arsenic, since the poisoning theory had persisted largely due to the element's historical popularity as a covert weapon. The data revealed arsenic levels well within the normal range for a 19th century individual, an outcome that undermined decades of speculation and forced investigators to widen their focus toward other environmental and medical factors. As they reconstructed Taylor's final days, researchers revisited the treatments he had received, noting that physicians of the era relied heavily on aggressive purgatives and stimulants that often produced physiological effects indistinguishable from poisoning. This context gained additional weight when historians highlighted the widespread use of mercury-based medications, particularly calomel and Dr. Benjamin Rush's purgative pills, which were composed of more than 50% mercury. Archaeologists had recently confirmed the enduring presence of these pills by detecting their mercury signatures in latrine sites used by the Lewis and Clark expedition, demonstrating how pervasively such compounds circulated through American medical practice. With this insight, scientists reassessed Taylor's symptoms and the toxicological data, concluding that his violent gastrointestinal decline aligned more plausibly with the combined impact of illness and intensive 19th century medical intervention rather than deliberate poisoning. This interpretation shifted the investigation toward a broader consideration of how medical norms, rather than political sabotage, shaped the president's fate. The larger medical horror of the 1800s. To fully understand the implications of Taylor's death, investigators had to expand their analysis beyond the president's final hours and step into the unsettling reality of 19th century medicine, a world where well-intentioned physicians often relied on treatments that modern science now recognizes as hazardous. Calomel, a mercury chloride compound prescribed to manage digestive distress, fever, or inflammation, was administered so routinely that many patients experienced chronic toxicity, without realizing that their declining health originated from the very remedies meant to help them. Medical manuals from the period revealed an unwavering confidence in these substances, with practitioners believing that strong purgation could expel harmful imbalances from the body, even when the resulting dehydration, organ strain, and metabolic shock intensified the underlying illness. The broader culture of therapeutics amplified these risks, since opiates, antimony, bloodletting, and blistering agents were deployed in combinations that placed enormous physiological stress on anyone subjected to them. Soldiers, frontier settlers, and political leaders all encountered these treatments, creating a landscape where recognizable symptoms, such as abdominal pain or fever, could stem from disease, the medications themselves, or the interaction between the two. In Taylor's case, historians noted that the therapies he received during his illness mirrored protocols that frequently worsened gastrointestinal infections, making it difficult for even skilled physicians to distinguish progression from complication. By situating Taylor's experience within this medical framework, researchers recognized that the tragedy surrounding his death reflected systemic limitations rather than malicious interference. The convergence of outdated theory, limited diagnostic tools, and powerful compounds illustrated how vulnerable individuals were to unintended harm during a period when scientific understanding had not yet caught up with clinical ambition. Rewriting the narrative. As the findings circulated among historians and medical scholars, the narrative surrounding Taylor's death began to shift from one dominated by conspiracy toward an interpretation grounded in scientific context and historical nuance. The toxicology results dispelled the notion of political assassination, yet they also revealed how profoundly medical practice shaped life and death outcomes in an era when physicians operated without the tools necessary to distinguish therapeutic benefit from physiological harm. This understanding reframed Taylor not as a victim of covert violence, but as an individual caught at the intersection of disease, limited medical knowledge, and earnest but hazardous treatment. The case became an instructive example of how myths can persist when evidence is incomplete, and how modern analysis can restore clarity to moments long obscured by rumor. In recognizing these dynamics, scholars found a more human story, one defined by vulnerability rather than intrigue, and deeply connected to the era that produced it. Zachary Taylor's fate reminds us how much of the past remains misunderstood until science brings it into focus. If stories like this deepen your curiosity about hidden history, consider liking the video, subscribing for more investigations, and sharing it with others who follow the mysteries time leaves behind.